Hey, biology, let's talk about some more stuff that we covered during the evolution unit so that you are ready for the test. Okay, so we've talked about phylogenetics, we've talked about how to classify organisms with the phylogenetic tree. We've talked about natural and artificial selection a little bit. So let's talk about natural selection a little bit more. So let's review that Clipland lab we did where you had birds with different sized beaks. Say this is a giant one. And they can eat different foods, and like let's say that they have a whole bunch of food. I don't know if you can see that or not. And some of them can eat the food, some of them can't. And then over time, the food changes. So the ones that have different sized beaks might be the ones that are more successful, right? Well, let's think if we can add any stuff to this. So the point of the Clipland lab, point, I guess. Salient point of the Clipland lab was natural selection favors different genes in different times. So natural selection favors different traits at different times. Okay, and remember what that means is if there's a whole lot of a really small food that only the little bird can eat, well, the little bird is going to be the most fit. So fitness is how good you are at natural selection. So how good, and that's a weird term, but good, weird extra line there, an organism is at living in the environment, and so not getting eaten, getting food, and reproducing. And this, everything that is alive has to deal with natural selection. Humans are weird, so don't think about that. But how good an organism is basically, fitness is a way to measure natural selection. So if in this population we had all of a sudden, where's my giant marker? If we only had gigantic food that only the big bird could eat, well then all of a sudden the little bird would not be selected because the little bird wouldn't be able to eat that anymore. Okay, and so suddenly the big bird would be selected. It would be better fit because the environment changes. Okay, so fitness and natural selection can changes based on environmental pressures. Mental pressures. Okay, and that can be stuff like weather. That can be growing season. That can be anything big changes. Let's just put big changes. Let's say we have a population. Let's say this population in the next generation, it's all just birds with giant beaks. Okay, so here's a bird with a giant beak. Here's a bird with a giant beak. Here's our eyeball. Okay, burp, burp. Here's another bird with a giant beak. They're doing great. Okay, boop, boop. There we go. And then all this, oh, you can't see them. And then all of a sudden, hello. Da-da-da. So here's a bunch of birds with giant beaks. Okay. Cool. And then all of a sudden, there's an earthquake, and there's like a canyon that rips these birds apart. Okay. So there's this giant canyon where all of a sudden the birds on this side can no longer access the birds on this side. Maybe they're flightless. Who knows? Who cares? Okay, so for some reason, these birds are now separated from these birds. Let's say over time, on this side, we end up with maybe there's a whole lot of big food. So they're doing great. They can eat all the really big food. So these guys flourish. They all do really good. They're really fit for that environment. But maybe on the other side, there's medium-sized food, and it's slightly different. And let's say within this population you have some variation where some of the birds, like this guy has a much smaller beak than this one. So maybe this one is selected against because he can no longer eat this food. Well, now this one's going to thrive. And maybe over time when these two birds are separated, these two subpopulations of this bird is separated by this canyon or whatever, maybe over time they're going to be subjected to different environmental pressures so that like hundreds or thousands of years later, thousands of years pass. All of a sudden, our birds are really, really different. So maybe the birds that were on this side, maybe they suddenly have a weird kind of haircut or a weird feather pattern, okay? So they look like this maybe. And maybe that canyon suddenly goes away somehow. So now these birds can interact with your original ancestor or the other birds on the other side, but they look so different that they're like, I don't want to have sexy time with that bird. They no longer interbreed, okay? So if they're no longer interbreeding because they're mutations that have been driven by natural selection on either side of the canyon, have been acting in different directions, that we now have two species. Two species, because they are not interbreeding. No breeding. Maybe if they do breed, their eggs don't hatch for some reason. Maybe if this one breeds with this one, then they make, and this happens sometimes in the wild, where you have a bird that produces an egg that's so big that or their bird itself is so big that when they sit on the egg, they break it for whatever reason. This is a big issue with DDT that we'll talk about later. But let's say there are no viable young. Okay? That means that there are two species, and this came from allopatric. Hello, Patrick, speciation. Because natural selection favored, it created, well, a geological event created a separation in the two populations, creating two different species. We know they're two different species because they no longer interbreed. So allopatric speciation happens because they don't interbreed. Let's see. We would say allopatric speciation occurred through the separation of the populations. This is all sorts of crooked. Because they don't interbreed, this supports the biological species model. Species model. Awesome. So what if something else had happened? What if something, let's go here. So when I was a kid, this wasn't pretty well accepted, but now it's pretty well accepted that the dinosaurs went extinct because a meteor hit the Earth and it made all of this ash go up into the air, and it changed the amount of light filtering down. And if you change the amount of light filtering down for the environment, or for the plants, they can't do as much photosynthesis. A bunch of plants die. And then if a bunch of plants die, then you're not going to be able to support your heterotrophs. And so the really big dinosaurs died off. So let's say we have a before scenario. Before. And we have these giant dinosaurs. You guys know how I love my dinosaurs. So this is my badly drawn dinosaur. Cool. He's doing great. Okay. He's eating really big plants. These plants with their big leaves. Okay. Awesome. And then all of a sudden there's a comet. And it kills the big plants. And then the dinosaur is very sad. Well, that dinosaur is not going to survive anymore because there's not enough food. But let's say there's something under here. There's another version of this guy. And you see this with the, well, we're not going to talk about that. But there's another little animal down here, let's say. And it's really teeny. And it can eat the little tiny leaves that are on the ground. Well, it's going to survive. So afterwards, these genes are going to get passed on because they're the ones that survived the environmental disaster or whatever happened. So after millions of years, all of a sudden we go from being having a bunch of really big dinosaurs to having a whole bunch of mammals, okay? And so the mammals they survived because their ancestor was the one that was able to pass on its genes. And that is evolution. So evolution is basically natural selection over time. And so it's natural selection and survival of the fittest. Fittest. Whatever. There are two T's. Okay, which means that if you have to be well suited for your environment and you have to be able to reproduce. You can be the best organism in your environment ever, but if you're not passing on your genes, you fail at evolution. Okay, so that's a very big deal. Let's think about a sympatric example of speciation. It could, yeah, it's kind of related to evolution. Okay, it is a part of evolution. So let's talk about, what do I want to think about? How about, it's hard to think of on the spot. Let's talk about fish. Maybe there's some fish. Maybe we have all these fish, and they have different, so here's my fish. Oh, that's a weird looking fish. So, why am I drawing weird fish? Bunch of fish. They all hang out in this environment. Okay, cool. They're doing great. And then some of them have there's a mutation that happens where suddenly they have some blue stripes. Cool. And those blue stripes, for some reason, half of the females are like, hey, cool, I dig blue stripes. And so the blue stripe ones suddenly no longer recognize and no longer mate with the non-blue striped ones. So that's weird. There's just a weird bias going on so that they don't reproduce with any that don't have blue stripes. Okay, so all of a sudden, you get all these birds over here, or sorry, these fish over here that have blue stripes. And they're becoming more and more genetically distinct than the fish over here with no blue stripes because they're not exchanging genes anymore. So it's kind of like the example of the Russian family. If humans reproduce really, really quickly instead of over like one or two every 20 years, you would have seen maybe some speciation happening in a royal family like that, where they're only interbreeding with family members. And so you're really concentrating the genes that are going on here and separating them from here, if we're talking humans. In the case of fish, this fish will say reproduces so quickly that you start to see evolutionary changes between these two species, because technically they're all swimming in the same pond or ocean, and they could really, in theory, go and reproduce with the other side, but they're just not doing it because of whatever bias. This is sympatric speciation. Speciation. Because it's happening in one place. Happens in one place. And technically they could go and mate with each other, but for some reason they don't. And now, millions of years later, however long later, you put them together and they still won't reproduce together, then that means that sympatric speciation happened. So if they're not reproducing together, this supports the biological idea. Supports biological species model. Now, if this is a case where the blue stripe ones are eating a certain kind of food that the non-blue stripe ones can't eat, so they're taking over a different niche, then you could say, and maybe that's why speciation happened, because they're eating something different, then that is a form of the ecological species model. Because they're partitioning their resources so that some eat a certain thing, some eat a different thing, and in theory they could interbreed, but they're not. And so, okay, well, that if they could interbreed but they're not, because if they're in the same place but they're not breeding, that's sympatric speciation. And then you could say specifically, well, if they're taking different chunks of the environment and using it, that's ecological species. If they're not doing that and they're just not interbreeding for some reason, that's biological species model. If for some reason you found a fossil that sort of looks like these fish and you can't like identify anything else about it, and you would say, I think I'm going to make this fossil fish, I'm going to call it one of these fish, that would be supporting the phylogenetic model. Okay? Or phylogenetic species model. You could also say if we take DNA from one of these and compare it to one of those and they are related even though they don't look the same at all, that would also support the phylogenetic model. If you had a fish like this living somewhere and then you found a fish in a very, very different place that also kind of looks like it and acts a lot like it and that kind of thing, and you were like, I wonder if they're the same species or not, that could support the morphological species model. Species model. And now it's tricky because just because two things look alike, we're finding out more and more, doesn't mean that they are related. We're finding a lot of I almost said homeopathic, homologous. A lot of things that we thought are homologous are actually analogous. So we're finding a lot of animals that have stripes, for example, that people thought were related. Turns out stripes are just really good at creating camouflage in forests. And so like the Tasmanian tiger and the actual tiger are not related at all just because they both have stripes, even though people tried to put them together because they both have stripes. Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about homology and analogy, and then I think you'll be ready for this test. So remember, homology is going to be same ancestor, different function. Okay, so that's going to be something like we have the shark body. Okay, so a shark body kind of looks like this with its tail going up like this, has a big fin like this, shark. Okay, and the dolphin body, okay, but the dolphin fins go out like this, okay, they have a dorsal fin, they have some fins like this, they have a nose, well, this is a weird looking dolphin, okay, so these two animals are wait, this is an analogy, this is a bad example, let's use the dolphin and the seal, okay, so seals Okay, so here's my seal. So dolphins and seals, what are they doing? So dolphins have tails, and seals have tails. Okay, but they are not from the same thing at all. So this is not an example of homology. So dolphin tails are made from their backbone. Seal tails are made from their feet. Okay, so this is an example of analogy. Okay, analogous features are ones that have same function but different source. Okay, so tails help both of these animals move, but they come from different things. So this came from the backbone, this came from the feet. In the case of the shark, though, the shark tail that's still a bad example. If we look at the shark and a fish, like a goldfish, boop, boop, here's our goldfish. The shark and a fish, their tails, those are still bad examples. Sorry, guys. It's hard to do homology sometimes. Let's take a dolphin and a cow. Boop. Here's my cow. There's some horns. Cow. Okay. Udders. Cow. Okay. If this is a cow and this is a dolphin, they both have tails. Okay. So dolphin tails and cow tails they come off the same thing. They are an extension of the backbone. Okay. But dolphin tails are used for swimming, and cow tails are used for getting rid of flies. Swat flies. You could also compare to the kangaroo. We talked about the kangaroo in one of my classes. Their tails are, I don't know how to draw a kangaroo. Bloop. There we go. Okay, so this is a kangaroo. Okay, its tail is also homologous. Look at all these tails. They're all extensions of backbones, okay? But in the case of the kangaroo, this is used for balance. Okay, the seal tail is analogous because it is not an extension of the backbone. It's just the feet stuck together. Okay, the feet have fused into this. And so it is analogous because it's different from all of these things. The tail of the seal is also analogous to the shark tail because, again, they're different origins, but they have the same function. Same thing with the seal to the fish. Okay, some other things you might think of birds. Okay, so if you have a penguin, this is a penguin, and a robin, which apparently all my birds look like this. Okay, so here's our bird. So penguins and, let's just call this a sparrow. Okay, their wings are homologous. Okay, they both have a common ancestor, whatever common ancestor bird that all birds have. But in the case of the penguin, the wings are used for swimming. In the case of the bird, the sparrow, the wings are used for flight. Okay, but if we have a bug, bloop, here's my butterfly. Let's just call this a fly. Fly. So if we have a fly and we compare the wings of the fly to the wings of a bird, then these are analogous. Wings. They're both used for flight. But in this case, the sparrow wings and the bird wings are from two different origins. So bugs have 6 feet. We learned this in kindergarten, whatever. Boop, boop. However I'm drawing them. Okay. The sparrows, they have 2 feet and 2 arms. And those upper arms are used for flight. We can also look at, if you look at a ladybug, okay? So in the case of, most bugs have 2 sets of wings. Most insects have 2 sets of wings. But in the case of the ladybug, 2 of those wings are no longer for flight. So 2 wings are for protection. They protect the flight wings. Okay? So compared to this insect, those protection wings are now analogous because they used to be used for flight in a common ancestor, but the ladybug has adapted, so those outermost wings are now a source of protection instead for their little flappy wings. Okay, hopefully these scribbles help with homology and analogy. Let me think about what else you might need to know. I think that's about it. Make sure you know how to read a graph. Think about the lizard model, what happened over time. In the case of our lizards, we had an island that was a control. We had a control set of islands, and we had these experimental islands. Okay, and on the on both sets of islands, we had some trees and we had some anoles. Okay, so the anoles or the anoles, bloop, bloop, they were these little lizards, and they can climb on the trees or they can hang out on the ground. The ones that are better at climbing on the trees are the ones with the smaller limbs, because even you can see as I drew it, it's hard for them to grab those trees if they have long legs. Okay, so over here, same thing. We have the anoles. Cool, awesome. And then we have a big scary lizard that also lives on this island. Okay, his whole thing was he had a big curly tail, and this lizard either ate these lizards directly or it ate the same food. So we saw that over time. So time passes. So over time, we saw that total numbers decreased. Total numbers of anoles decreased dramatically. OMG, OMG. And so from that, because the only difference between these islands were these curly predator lizards, we could say, I bet that curly predator lizard is causing a very much sharper decline in these numbers of lizards. It makes sense. You have something here that's either eating the lizard directly or eating its food. Of course, there's going to be way fewer of these lizards altogether. On this island, the reason why there were fewer total is because there's other stuff that eats lizards too, and they're dumb and they die and it happens. But we also noticed that over here, there were no lizards on the ground anymore. Sorry, no anoles, which is a kind of lizard. No anole on ground. Okay, so they're all hiding in the trees or living in the trees sometime over time. So we can see very quickly in only 12 months that we see, it's kind of, the guy in the video liked to say it was natural selection in action, because you could see this predator lizard somehow caused a change in distribution of the anole lizards. All of a sudden, there's a lot fewer, and the ones we do find are all living in the trees. Okay, so there's something about this predator lizard that is causing these lizards to be found in trees more. And so that was the conclusion being this is a form of natural selection. We could see that over time, the lizard, we also saw that the lizards in the trees then over time had much shorter legs than the original lizards did, or they did at the beginning of the study. So this is an example of how they were trying to say, why is it that on the mainland, so these are islands, island. So on the mainland, we have 4 different kinds of lizards. We have a ground anole, we have a grass anole, we have a bush anole, and then we also have a tree anole. So how did this happen? Did they all have a common ancestor? Well, probably. There was probably some common ancestor that came into this place, and then it used, just over time, there was resource partitioning. So some of them live on the ground, some of them live in the grass, some live in the bush, some live in the tree. And the ones that live there, they became more and more isolated genetically from each other. So they now can no longer interbreed. So that means that through resource partitioning, or the ecological species model, we saw speciation. And this is sympatric speciation because it is all happening in one place, just different parts of a place. Okay, so sympatric speciation probably happened here. Speciation. And this is the ecological model. Ecological species model. And so what they were doing in this experiment was trying to simulate this same thing, okay? So could it be as simple as just some predator was around that caused a difference in the behavior of the lizards that would then lead to a difference in how they use their environment? So then we could kind of hypothesize that in 100 years or so, if you were to go back and check out these 2 islands, would this lizard be so distinct compared to these lizards that if you put them together, they would no longer interbreed? So if later, like you could say 100 years later, and even that's really short for biology, you could take a control lizard and an experimental lizard, or a anole, which is the kind of lizard. Do they breed? If yes, then they're still the same species. If no, then we saw speciation. Okay, and we often see speciation in islands because there's no way for these 2 places to come. They're under different ecological pressures, and so they kind of mutate and diverge in different ways. Okay, I think you guys are going to do great on this test. I think all you need to do is make sure you really read it, Read your questions. Think about natural and artificial selection. And yeah, I think I'll do great. Bye, guys.